Poplio. Today, on the 32nd day of my action, since yesterday I took a break due to the heat, I will talk about the evolution of the methods used to destroy the human reproductive system in order to prevent births and shut people out of the cycle of procreation. I apologize in advance for the graphic nature of the material I'm about to present and the emotional impact it may have. Unfortunately, there is no way around it, since the human reproductive organs are the primary targets of the Depop program. There are three broad categories of methods used to destroy the human reproductive system. Let me now turn to the wall behind me and point them out. We have mutilation, segregation, and the third one, sterilization. I could have added a fourth one, obstruction, which involves birth control methods, but since those are voluntary and I have already discussed them, I decided to leave that out for today. So, turning now to the first category, that of mutilation. Circumcision in males and females. In females, it is called female genital mutilation, which has been practiced by Judaism, Islam, sub-Saharan African tribes, and Australia's Aboriginals, is the first I will start with. Priests, religion, population control, and sexual mutilation go hand in hand. The earliest records we have date back to the ancient Egyptians some 4,000 years ago. They pioneered castration, circumcision, infibulation, and female genital mutilation. The circumcision of males and the infibulation of females at puberty were done to destroy sexual enjoyment by making intercourse painful or impossible for women and less rewarding for men. The priests rationalized circumcision and infibulation as a rite of passage from childhood to adulthood. Circumcision involved excising a triangular section or simply making a longitudinal incision in the dorsal face of the foreskin of boys aged 10 to 12. In either case, the prepucium or the foreskin was not completely removed, but it was painful and bloody, and as such a traumatic experience never to be forgotten. While this partial form of circumcision had little or no bearing on the ability to procreate, many boys undoubtedly lost their lives as a result of infections and other complications, which are far more common for adolescents than for neonates or infants, even in our times. 6% for adolescents versus 0.5% for infants. Girls between the ages of 6 and 10 were subjected to even more pain and suffering by a procedure now called pharaonic infibulation that almost completely closed the vaginal orifice by removing the entire clitoris and labia minora, cutting away parts of the labia majora, and then sewing together the remaining parts of the labia majora to create a skin seal, leaving only a small opening for the passage of urine and menstrual blood. Circumcision and infibulation are the world's oldest operations, and they are represented here in my graph: circumcision and pharaonic infibulation. Needless to say, many boys, but especially girls, died of infections following these operations. To what extent these invasive surgical procedures were performed is impossible to say, though some mummies bear their mark, that of Amenhotep I, for instance. But we know that they were not universal in pharaonic times. To get people to accept them, priests manipulated the population to believe that adolescents cannot be admitted into the adult world until they have been rid of the physical characteristics of the opposite sex, and that the foreskin represents the female aspect in a male and the clitoris is the male aspect in the female, and as such had to be cut out. What is certain is that male circumcision remained mandatory among the priestly caste, while the rest of the Egyptian population abandoned it by the 2nd century CE. As we will see, male circumcision came back with a vengeance on account of Judaism and Islam in later centuries. Female circumcision continued to grow by leaps and bounds, but the pharaonic form, that of infibulation, which is by far the most radical, has given way to less invasive forms. To date, about 3% of the women and 38% of the men worldwide are circumcised. In Egypt, the situation is a lot worse, since 87% of the women and 94% of the men have been subjected to genital mutilation. The second method is that of castration, the removal of the testicles. As gruesome as they appear to us today, circumcision and infibulation are actually softer versions of the Egyptian and Babylonian practice of severing men's genitals, castration, or emasculation, a punishment reserved for prisoners of war, both dead and alive, as well as for men convicted of rape. Pharaonic and Babylonian law stated that anyone who raped a free woman must have his genitals cut off, since the crime included 3 very great evils: insult, corruption of morals, and confusion of offspring. And the guilty part would carry unto death an indelible mark that must have prevented others from breaking the law by warning of this punishment. In time, the ambit of castration extended to also prevent the propagation of weaklings, which is the beginning of racial improvement, eugenics. Humans have been castrated for the same reasons as animals, where the practice actually began, namely to make them more docile and to stop them from breeding. Though animals have also been subjected to improve their taste, as in the case of capons, for instance, castrated male chickens. Irrespective of the method of emasculation and their subsequent employment, the resulting men have been called eunuchs, or guardians of the bed, since they were often used as harem guards to safeguard the virginity and fidelity of the females. Castration throughout the ages has been done in 3 ways: by amputating the penis, cutting off the testicles, or total emasculation, meaning cutting off both. And we have a picture representing that here. It was done to British soldiers, probably by Muslim soldiers. If the operation was performed on babies, then the removal of the genitalia was the preferred method, but if done later in life, then only the testicles were removed. In either case, the males were no longer capable of procreation and suffered psychological changes, but only in the case of prepubescent castration did they also suffer extensive physiological changes. While castration is the world's first method of involuntary sterilization and is permanent and 100% effective, male and female circumcision are mostly symbolic forms of castration, and while they make sexual intercourse less pleasurable and reduce the number of children, they do not stop people from procreating altogether, unless of course in the process of performing a circumcision, the canal through which the semen flows is also damaged. Nevertheless, the impact of these 3 forms of sexual mutilation on population growth has been extensive, which is why they are still in use today, and for this we have the Egyptians to thank. As for the immeasurable pain and suffering they have caused to billions of people throughout history and until the present day, we also have the Egyptians, the world's first depopulationists, to blame for. The third method I want to discuss is that of foot binding. Foot binding, chanzu in Chinese, is a uniquely Chinese method of population control. And I have 2 pictures representing it here and here. It flourished because it allowed the authorities to accomplish several vital population control objectives: reduce the population, reduce the birth rate, rebalance the gender ratio, and ease the old age burden. The first two are obvious since infection killed a good number of women and their lifelong disability made them unable to bear and care for many children, but the last two are not. Since it could not be known in advance how many men would lose their lives in war to match their number with an equal number of females through sex-selective infanticide, the Chinese found a way to fine-tune gender balance through the practice of foot binding, an exclusively Chinese and a singularly cruel method that killed 1 in 10 women, or if need be, far more, and made the rest less fertile or even infertile by condemning them to a life of physical disability, chronic illness, and economic dependence. Starting before the arch of the foot was fully developed, thus between the ages of 3 and 9, the procedure involved the following. First, the feet of the girl were plunged into hot water and her toenails clipped short. Then the feet were massaged and oiled before all the toes, except the big toe, were broken and bound flat against the sole, making a triangle shape. Next, her arch was strained as the foot was bent double. Finally, the feet were bound in place using a silk strip measuring 10 feet long and 2 inches wide. These wrappings were briefly removed every 2 days to prevent blood and pus from infecting the foot. Sometimes excess flesh was cut away or encouraged to rot. The girls were forced to walk long distances in order to hasten the breaking of their arches, the foot arches that is. Over time, the wrappings became tighter and the shoes smaller as the heel and sole were crushed together. After 2 years, the process was complete, creating a deep cleft that could hold a coin in place. Once a foot had been crushed and bound, the shape could not be reversed without a woman undergoing the same pain all over again. The practice had innocent beginnings. Dancers of the imperial harem during the Southern Tang dynasty, 937 to 976 CE, tied their feet to keep their toes firmly in place so they could dance on the tip of their toes. It was, in other words, the precursor to ballet shoes and limited to imperial dancers. In time, however, the practice was emulated by higher class women who sought to make their feet appear dainty, just as those of the dancers. China's population controllers saw an opportunity and seized it by promoting foot binding as an ideal of female beauty. Despite its grotesqueness, as you can see, and these are 2 mild examples, and to universalize it, they made it a precondition of marriage, despite being repulsive to men and women alike. One eminent song scholar and philosopher, Zhu Xi, who lived from 1130 to 1200 CE, assisted in accelerating the spread of foot binding. Zhu Xi was an ardent supporter of foot binding and introduced the practice into southern Fujian province. He observed that Fujianese women tended to be unchaste and to indulge in lewdness, and therefore he ordered that all women's feet be bound to an excessive degree, causing them to hobble about with great difficulty. With such difficulty in movement, bound foot women were expected to stay at home and devote themselves entirely to their household obligations. In Zhu Xi's opinion, the Chinese woman should preserve chastity after the death of her husband, and it was better for the woman to starve than remarry. And a woman with crippled feet would, of course, starve. This regulated proper relations between the sexes in a family and enforced the spread of traditional Chinese culture. The practice did not trickle down into the mainstream, but was forced onto the general population through deliberate propaganda, initially for its utility in keeping women chaste and dependent and therefore subservient to men, but also for condemning widows to a fast death to relieve society from the burden of having to care for the elderly. In time, however, its usefulness for population control became evident, since China's rulers would have noticed that foot-bound girls often died from infection or suicide, and those who made it to adulthood had fewer children, and as the needs of the state to lower the population grew more desperate, foot binding too became increasingly extreme and grotesque. The 16th century saw the method undergo a major change in which the four toes, not including the big toe, were folded under. Footwear and excavations from the Song to the Yuan dynasty, Song dynasty 960 to 1279, the Yuan dynasty 1271 from 1368, indicate that the goal in earlier times was to make the foot narrower and toes pointed, but that the arch was not broken as it would be in the later phase. The cleavage formed by the broken arch became the site of erotic fascination, hence the beginning of the so-called cult of the golden lotus. Along with the 3-inch golden lotus, imagine that, 3-inch cleft in the foot, came the advent of high heels. Although the old way of leaving the sole flat never completely disappeared, the new way became fashionable, first among the elite, then downward along the social ladder. To sell the idea that unnaturally small feet are desirable and aid in the dissemination of this violent practice among all classes, the Chinese elites presented foot binding as a status symbol and a mark of feminine beauty, without which a woman's chances of marriage greatly diminished. Under the pretext of making women more desirable, they first began to bind the feet of the daughters of the upper class, and later also of peasant and working class girls during early childhood in such a way as to prevent their growth. This exceedingly cruel and painful practice and the hideously deformed and crippled feet it produced was made appealing through manipulative language that referred to the mutilated products as lotus feet, thus as something dainty and beautiful, and through inverted logic that presented such hideously deformed feet that looked like animal hoofs as erotic, thus as the absolute opposite of what they were. As all population controllers have done throughout the ages, they turned reality upside down and inside out to present something as the absolute opposite of what it is. So they turned a hideous deformity into a so-called mark of beauty. They succeeded because the population was illiterate, downtrodden, obedient, and conformist, but also because the need to reduce the number of children was universal and compelled the poor far more than the rich to go to extremes. All the propaganda in the world could not hide the fact that both men and women then and now found the sight of bounded feet repulsive, which is why women always covered their deformed feet with special slippers, even at night, and if otherwise nude and during sexual intercourse, and never exposed their mutilated feet to men or to anyone else for that matter, least of all for erotic purposes. Had men found bound feet erotic, they would have insisted on seeing their women barefoot as often as possible, especially in bed, and countless accounts of all manner of sexual perversions involving bound feet would have survived in literature, art, and in legal and medical accounts. But none exist other than the propagandistic notion that bound feet were erotic, which grossly contradicts the reality that they were never shown in life or depicted in art. Bound feet were a strict taboo. A Western missionary active in China in 1869 described the taboo of seeing bound feet and the repulsion Chinese men and women felt towards them. By no means, I quote now, by no means can a sight of them, that is to say of the bound feet, be had for examination. There is a sort of Masonic secrecy about them. The maid turns away her gaze. The repulsion is sometimes so great that it is said that the husband even is not permitted to see the feet of his wife. End of quote. The result of this painful and inhumane form of mutilation was that any number of young girls could be killed until they reached marriage age, and in this fashion superfluous women could be discarded. Foot binding served as a delayed form of abortion or infanticide. Under the best circumstances, at least 10% of the girls with bound feet died of infection, and the rest suffered lifelong disability and complications such as ulcerations, paralysis, gangrene, septicemia, arthritis, malodor, and mortification of the lower limbs. The number could be increased at will by simply making the binds tighter and inserting glass or tile shards between the toes to cause infection and gangrene, which was standard practice. Imagine that, inserting glass shards between the toes of little girls. But equalization of the male-female ratio was not the only population control objectives accomplished through foot binding. By physically handicapping women, they could be sequestered at home and prevented from having sexual intercourse prior to marriage. Their fidelity could be assured during marriage. Their fertility could be reduced by virtue of being physically handicapped. Their sexual appeal to men lowered by their hideous deformity, and consequently the frequency of sex and the likelihood of pregnancy. The number of children they produce could be reduced by forcing both men and women into arranged marriages, and they could be made entirely dependent on men so as to starve them to death rather than remarry if they became widowed. These are the 6 additional ways in which foot binding helped the population control prerogative. The modern version is the transgender ideology and sex change operation. The same propaganda and indoctrination used in the past is used today for the transgender ideology. I have the transgender ideology represented here by this poster. Gender reassignment surgery, transition from male to female, and from female to male. The ultimate goal of the transgender ideology is to rip the sexual organs out of young people and make them sterile for life. To sell this method of population control, the depopulationists disseminate the fiction that a transgender person has a gender identity different from that typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. This so-called gender dysphoria, which replaced the earlier and correct term of gender identity disorder, is the supposed distress a person experiences due to inconsistency between their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth. When the indoctrination is complete, the brainwashed person will desire medical assistance to medically or surgically transition from one sex to another. The so-called treatment for gender dysphoria includes puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy, gender-affirming surgeries, note the name, which are nothing more than modern-day versions of castration in males and infibulation in females, followed by psychotherapy to keep the victim sufficiently sane to be productive members of society. Male to female transitioning requires converting male anatomy to female anatomy, which involves removing the penis, reshaping genital tissue to appear more female, and constructing a vagina. Following surgery, estrogen, a female hormone, will stimulate breast development, widen the hips, inhibit the growth of facial hair, and slightly increase voice pitch. Female to male transitioning requires the removal of the uterus and ovaries, followed by genital reconstruction procedures that use either the clitoris, which is enlarged by hormones, or rely on tissue grafts from the arm, the thigh, or the belly to construct the penis around an erectile prosthetic. Breasts are surgically altered to look less feminine. This process involves removing breast tissue and excess skin and reducing and properly positioning the nipples and areolae. Androgens, male hormones, are then prescribed to stimulate the development of facial and chest hair and cause the voice to deepen. While this horror show is framed as medical treatment and depop surgeons and doctors perform these mutilations, the clerics are pushing hard for social acceptance of these monstrosities as normal. We have all seen with disgust Pope Francis incessantly pushing the LGBTQ agenda. The transgender propaganda is nothing more than the modern form of castration and female genital mutilation. The result is the same. Permanent sterility, which is why I place them on the same roll castration, pharaonic infibulation, and gender reassignment. Now let's move on to the second category, that of segregation. And in terms of segregation, the method of segregation, or rather the methods of segregation, are two: physical and mental. I have represented the physical segregation above and the mental below. Let's start with the physical. Priests, religion, population control, and segregation of the sexes go hand in hand. As with mutilation, it is also organized religion that pioneered this more humane form of birth control, namely the physical separation of men and women through the institution of monasticism, so they can be prevented from engaging in any sexual intercourse whatsoever. To this end, religion invented the notion of commitment to God, pushed the notion of an ascetic life, and forced people to accept the triple vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty, so that monks and nuns would not pose an economic burden on society and would require the least resources to keep them alive. Chastity, so they could not engage in sex and therefore reproduce. And obedience, so they do as they are told for their entire lives and do not transgress their vows. Females were kept in convents and males in monasteries. For males, there is the cenobitic or communal life of monasticism and the eremitic or solitary type of monasticism. Many religions have the institution of monasticism: Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Jainism, but also Judaism and Sikhism, though not as widespread or formalized. Islam is the only major religion that discouraged monasticism and created its own parallel solutions instead, namely polygamy and harems. By allowing men to marry more than one woman, Islam solved the problem of excess women in the aftermath of war, and by allowing wealthy men to keep as many women as they could afford in harems, Islam eliminated a proportion of women from the cycle of procreation, especially the least attractive women. Few people are aware that the Islamic version of a convent is the harem, which is why I put the women of this Iranian or Persian harem on the same line as these Catholic nuns. Now, women were separated from the population at large and guarded by eunuchs, castrated men, these type of fellows, and they remained imprisoned in the harems for life, and like nuns, deprived of sex. Wealthy men could afford to keep the women in their harems, segregated them from the population at large, and whereas common men could not afford to segregate their fewer women in their smaller harems from the population at large. Instead, society forced and continued to force women to cover their bodies from head to toe in their burqas so that not an inch of flesh can be seen by men. In effect, Islam has attempted to turn the entire society into a monastery or a convent where men and women are permanently separated. Now, a modern version of segregation is that of imprisonment, it is the equivalent of monasticism, the modern equivalent of monasticism. Formerly acceptable social behaviors have been criminalized and the sentences extended in order to incarcerate more men and keep them for longer in prison, and therefore separate from women so they cannot impregnate them, which is why conjugal visits are denied. The US has taken this form of segregation farther than any other country in the world, which is why the US has 20% of the world's incarcerated population, but only 4 to 5% of the world's population. The second type of segregation is mental. And people are encouraged to engage in sexually aberrant practices among members of the same sex, since this form of sexual intercourse cannot result in the conception and birth of a child. The first method, that of monasticism, was for religious people who were physically segregated from the rest of the population, while the second was for common people who could not be physically segregated. Among mental forms of segregation, we have pederasty or homosexuality and its female version, lesbianism, intercrural sex, and last, the LGBTQ, and I have them represented here. Intercrural sex, pederasty, for which the Greeks are famous, the LGBTQ from the Western world, and the so-called third sex of India, which is the Indian version of LGBTQ. Let me start with pederasty or homosexuality and intercrural sex. The ancient Greeks used military training in the agoge, those are military schools, war military schools, as a way to sexually confuse and compromise the male population and cause, if not all, then most males to be pederasts. It did this through a coming-of-age rite that paired adolescent boys with adult males, whereby the adult males played the role of older sexual actors and the dominant participants of the sexual act, so-called erastes in Greek, which meant lover, while the adolescent boys played the role of passive and subordinate sexual participants, so-called eromenos, which meant beloved. The practice of pederasty appears to have originated in Crete in the 7th century BCE and came into prominence towards the end of the Archaic period, 800 to 480 BCE. By the 5th century BCE, the custom of pederasty became established throughout the Hellenic world. In time, the Greeks promoted homosexuality as a morally acceptable form of sexual gratification, despite being fully aware that it violates the laws of nature. To conventionalize and deeply ingrain this unnatural sexual behavior into the psyche of the people, the social architects of ancient Greece labeled the gods themselves as incorrigible pederasts. By depicting the gods themselves as homosexual pedophiles, the people were conditioned to view and accept this as not only the norm, but as the ideal form of sexuality, a perverse distortion of the natural order that is being repeated in our own century through the LGBTQ propaganda that North America and Western European depopulationists are relentlessly forcing upon the world's youth through the media in an attempt to sexually confuse them to such an extent as to drive them to seek sex reassignment surgery, and in this fashion eliminate a good proportion of the population from the reproductive cycle. The Greek pederasts practiced intercrural sex, in which the penis is placed between the receiving partner's thighs. It is a non-penetrative type of sex. They used Greek literature to give it social prominence. Literature and religion were used as vehicles for warping heterosexuality, which is why Greek literature abounds with homosexual couples who play central and heroic roles. Pederasty was one of the most reprehensible aspects of Greek culture, but nowhere near as reprehensible as castration. You see the result right here, which other contemporary cultures practiced in order to exclude some men from procreation and thus limit births. The Greek method of diverting the male sexual urges towards fruitless reproduction with adolescent males was far more humane, civilized, and equitable than the castration of males practiced by the Achaemenid Persians, 522 to 486 BCE, and other civilizations at that time, and inherited from the Babylonian Empire, 1895 to 539 CE. It was also a temporary rather than a permanent method of taking men out of reproduction. Seen in this light, Greek non-penetrative pederasty was centuries ahead of Persian castration and certainly preferable to it as a method of population control, especially since there is no evidence that anyone was forced into pederasty, but merely coaxed into it, and therefore some, even among the free men, chose not to engage in it despite heavy social conditioning. The Persians, by comparison, continued to castrate men until the end of the Qajar dynasty, which ended in 1925 CE. The Greeks of the freeman class accepted pederasty and conformed to the homosexual ethos because it gave them a way in which to limit childbirth without outright repressing their sexual urges. By programming young men to satisfy their carnality with adolescent boys and entrenching this practice from generation to generation through military and athletic institutions and reinforcing it through literature and art, undesired pregnancies among females were avoided, in part if not in full. And since males were able to refrain from sexual intercourse with women until the age of 30, when they were finally allowed to marry, and by which time many would have already died in war without leaving any children behind, they could bypass life's most fertile and sexually active decade, from age 20 to 30, without once touching a woman, for procreative purposes at least, since prostitution was fair game, which, needless to say, had a significant downward effect on the birth rate. Now on to the third category of methods, that of sterilization. We have, covert chemical sterilization through the use of endocrine disruptors. Then we have the sterilization through vaccination. And then we have the Indian version of surgical sterilization, whereby men are subjected to vasectomies and women to tubal ligations. Now, the entire developed world and increasingly the developing world sterilize their people by inserting endocrine disruptors in their food, water, beverages, and body care products. They come in the form of pesticides, food preservatives, flame retardants, phthalates, PFAs, phytoestrogens, and bisphenols, to name but a few. There are hundreds in Europe's food and thousands in America's. As a result of decades of poisoning with endocrine disruptors, a third of the population of the developed world is sterile, and the remaining two-thirds are subfertile. This is a primary reason why the total fertility rate of 110 countries is at sub-replacement level. Surgical sterilization, as I said, in females, tubal ligation, and in males, vasectomy. India is particularly keen on surgical sterilization. Some 80% of India's women have undergone tubal ligations, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Worldwide, 180 million women have undergone tubal ligation, and about 60 million men have undergone vasectomy. Sterilization by vaccination, one of the latest methodologies. Depo-Provera vaccines have always been pushed onto the population of the developing world, but sterilization by vaccination is done mostly involuntarily, both in the developed and developing world, with vaccines allegedly meant to prevent cervical cancer, the HPV vaccine, tetanus, malaria, influenza, hepatitis, and more recently, COVID. In 2019, prior to the immunization of 6 billion people with COVID mRNA vaccines, the total fertility rate of the global population was nearly 2.4 births per woman. In 2024, the global TFR is 2.2 children per woman, a significant decrease in just 4 years. To the three broad methods I presented here, mutilation, segregation, and sterilization, I could have added another one, as I said earlier, namely obstruction, which is done with birth control. But since I covered birth control in a previous lesson, and since birth control is a voluntary method, I decided to leave it out of today's lesson. The universal use of birth control, however, is the safe solution that will allow us to finally civilize the program of population control by bringing it out in the open and legislating a population stabilization law. I will mention a few early birth control methods just as a way to illustrate how far we have come in this respect. The Egyptians appear to have also been the first to invent birth control methods and to induce abortion. 3 papyri have survived that provide us with the evidence to this effect: the Kahun gynecological papyrus from 825 BCE, the Ebers papyrus from 1540 BCE, and the Brugsch papyrus from 1300 BCE. The oldest of the 3, the Kahun gynecological papyrus, provides 2 recipes for contraception, both concoctions to be inserted as pessaries into the vagina, tight against the cervix. The first concoction made of crocodile dung mixed with sour milk. No, I'm not kidding you. Crocodile dung. And the second one, honey on a natron bed. Natron being a carbonate salt Egyptians used as a cleaning product for both home and the body that was found in deposits in the Wadi el-Natrun, the so-called Natron Valley. The Ebers Papyrus prescribes prolonged lactation up to 3 years for spacing births and the use of a lint tampon to prevent conception. As an abortifacient, that is to say something that causes miscarriage, it prescribes a mixture of acacia tips with dates and colocynth, that's bitter apple, bound together with honey and placed in the vulva. The lactic acid contained in the acacia has confirmed spermicidal effects, while colocynth is a natural abortifacient still used today. The Brooks Papyrus, not to be outdone, suggests a method of birth prevention. As a method of birth prevention, the fumigation of the vagina with mimi. Mimi is wheat or sorghum, to be done by the woman just before intercourse, and drinking celery or mandrake boiled together with sweet beer and fat for 4 mornings after intercourse as a sort of morning after pill. Another concoction was made from crocodile dung mixed with fermented dough, which lacked any effectiveness as a preservative but served as a rudimentary diaphragm. Egyptian men, for their part, are the first in history to have used condoms made of linen sheath by 1000 BCE, but their purpose was to protect them from tropical diseases like bilharzia and not necessarily to prevent conception. Had these contraceptive methods been effective, the priests and the pharaohs would have been spared the trouble of having to organize society around the population control prerogative. Nevertheless, they represent a first attempt to find ways to prevent conception scientifically, so the need to end lives mechanically would no longer be necessary. As inventors of these contraceptive methods, the priests may well have been the only people in society to know them and to use them effectively, especially since they too were married and could test their efficacy. Given the central role of priests in population control, it was to be expected that they were the inventors of these first methods of birth prevention, and indeed this is the case since the priests were also the doctors. Doctors were trained in temples and medical care was free. Public medicine, therefore, is also an Egyptian invention. Free and public medicine, however, served primarily the state in controlling population growth and only secondarily the patient then and now. The time has come to stop the horror that you see on this wall behind me and to evolve to a population stabilization law and effective use of safe birth control methods. If mankind continues in this fashion, it will self-destruct. Thank you for your attention.